Yeah, not just. Actually, I want to talk about a process that is sometimes dubbed the watershed between the old Chinese. Yeah, I'll explain that in a moment. There's a process that is sometimes dubbed the watershed between the old or ancient Chinese writing system and the modern one. And this change occurred roughly 2,000 years ago. It took time. The change took time. It took the time of about 600 years. And in Chinese, it's a very well-known process by the Chinese name of Li Bian, which I try to call Li variation in my presentation. In the meantime, I have thought maybe I should call it Li shift in the future, because it can be likened to a vowel shift, although it happened on the graphic level. So why should we talk, or why do I want to talk to you about this? One reason is that this process undoubtedly happened, but it's completely underrepresented in literature that is accessible to us, who most of us read English or French or maybe Latin or Italian and do not read Chinese. There's a growing body of literature in Chinese about the Li Bian. And when we learn Chinese, now I have to adapt to a French keyboard, which is a challenge in itself to me. The pinyin is switched on. Okay. So maybe it should come up sometime. I don't know why I don't get characters offered. Help! Oh, I know. It was the capitals was arrested. No, that's better. No. My employer gives me a machine from the Windows world, so I'm challenged here on several aspects. When we learn Chinese, image, I know enough French to see, we are often given illustrations like this one that show how individual characters changed from ancient forms to their present forms. Now these illustrations, where did it go, are very amusing, and they are helpful for the learner, no doubt about that. But there's an example here, actually. Those who read Japanese or Chinese know that this means bird, and you see here different forms that the word bird was written in during history. It is helpful for the learner to understand what the present character looks like, why it has taken this shape. However, and pictographic characters, originally very pictographic characters of high iconicity, are preferably taken for this kind of illustration. But this kind of illustration does not give you an idea what happened to the system over this change that took 600 years, which I'm going to talk about. And to talk about this change means to broaden our perspective, widen our knowledge of this Chinese character system, and maybe not fall victim so easily to claims that all characters supposedly are pictographic and others that we can sometimes read in popular literature. So for the ease of this presentation, I shall assume that you know the basic facts of life about Chinese, of course, even though you probably are not all fluent readers in Chinese, which I do not blame you for. So to put things into perspective, we need to be aware that early Chinese wrote quite differently, not just concerning the shapes of the characters, but also the materials used. French keyboard. No, that's it. The materials used. Here we see a piece of oracle bone. 3,500 years ago, roundabout, Chinese people who could write wrote down oracle questions on bones and on plastrons of tortoise shells and on bones, preferably the scapula of oxen. But other materials were also used. And of course the material had a certain influence on the shape of the characters. There is not much roundness that you can get when you etch into bony material. Even in, well, I don't want to, if I go into this too far, we get off track. So from the oracle bone era, here are some variations of characters that you should get. You should bear in mind, although some of these characters look very pictographic, like the ones in this. Do you see the cursor when I move it? Yes, thank you. Look very pictographic, and some look even more pictographic to specialists of archaeology and early culture who know more about the material and spiritual culture of those days than we do. We also have archaeological finds of bronze material that have characters on them. And the bronze material allows you for different shapes. They allow you to get filled areas and round shapes, which bony material does not. What I wanted to say, though, is that even in the early characters already show that there are from the deciphered fragments, about 25% roundabout, that are of the type of phonetic and signific combined to make up one character, of which the semantic or signific component gives you a rough idea of what area to look at for the meaning of the complete character, and the other component gives you a hint as to the pronunciation. Regrettably, there were no cassette tapes and things, so we do not really know what the concrete sounds were. For those who are familiar with Sino-Japanese or Chinese writing, maybe seal script or great and lesser seal script is a concept that you're familiar with. I'm fighting with a machine here. How do I scroll? Well, life's tough. How do I scroll? Rechts und links. Okay, nicht up and down. Okay, I need to. It doesn't work for me. It just worked for you, but it doesn't work for me. The machine knows that I'm not him.
That's his master's voice.
Yes? Okay, now I want to scroll up to get to the input field again. It's master's voice, master's finger. Thank you. Would you just take a seat and help me when the need arises? How do I go about this? Later bronzes show a different type of script, which we call the Great Seal script. And maybe you know that towards the end of the third century of the Common Era, towards the end of the third century before the Common Era, China was united for the first time. At that time, the writing that was employed was the Great Seal script. No. Chuan. The Great Seal script. Which you see some specimen of here, and I'm not going to go into details. This script was still very unwieldy. We have bronzes and we have other types of material with characters of the script on it. It was unwieldy, and on the bronzes you see different phenomena, that for the same word you see characters that are composed of the same components but arranged differently. The positions and the spatial arrangement was differently, although the texts and specialists tell us that it's the same character, an allograph in our diction today. When China After China had been united, this Great Seal script was, I'm getting very sketchy here, was simplified to so-called small seal script, and this picture shows you a rough comparison of characters in Great Seal script and Small Seal script. At this time, another development had already taken place. People were increasingly, well, actually, maybe people were not increasingly doing something else, but there were more finds, more archaeological findings from an era, because conditions were better for these things to be preserved, of writings that were more private in nature and thus did not have to be so officially pretty, like inscriptions on bronzes. Like they were executed with brushes on slips of wood or bamboo, and under good conditions, dry, with a heap of sand on top of it, these writings could be preserved. People were writing a kind of shorthand that was, of course, based on the official script of the time, but then started a life of its own. And that's the Li script, or Li writing. Li meaning somebody subordinate, a scribe, somebody who has to serve somebody else and do the writing. I already mentioned the unification of the empire, of the Chinese empire, and the unified empire was surprisingly modern. It had an administration that was based on documentary processes. So you had a lot of writing to do if you worked in this administration. Trade had to be documented. There was a notary. So a lot of writing was to be done, and it needed to be done more quickly. And things needed to be recorded that had not been in the need to be recorded before. So this brush writing on other materials than bronze, and the pressures of modern administration necessitated or drove a development that eventually led to the modern Chinese writing. What happened? Well, there are changes that happened on the formal level of things. You see here that crooked lines, you see bent lines. In other pictures, you see round shapes. That's tedious and time-consuming to write. With a brush, thank you. With a brush, you get into angles and straight lines. So actually, lines that had been bent were straightened. This necessitated angles to appear where changes of direction were needed. Lines that had been lines before were lengthened or shortened to get characters into a hypothetical rectangle, which was at the beginning rather broad or wide and not so high like today. I need to go up again. There were processes like this on the formal level, but the more interesting things happened on the structural level. I mentioned here's a Lishu character. Yeah, you see angles and straight lines. This is only at the end of the line. It's something that will later develop into a real hook. On the structural level, the components that had changed their positions in allographs before increasingly found their fixed positions in a character that was not longer an allotment of allographs. They found their position, and in the process, some of them had to split up because in one position was on the side and another position in other characters was at the bottom. So they had to split up, and one example of this is the heart. And we hope we'll get some pictures of the heart that will show. Now, of course, that had to happen. 心字可能更确切一点。This is the heart character, and this is the shape it remains in at the bottom. However, when it needs to be written on the side, you know what really happened to me? When I was on the bus this morning, it came to my mind that my USB stick was in my hotel room. So I need to improvise here. I need a certain qing. Let's look for the qing kuang. The qing gives me a different. I don't want this. And there's no blackboard here either. Let's look for the shu xin. Anyway, I just have to go like this. Some components that had been one component before split up into different forms. In other cases, several components that had been different before melted into one. And actually, we do have an example, and that's the chun. We do have an example, a very good example, of several characters. I was not supposed to get up because of the camera. Okay, I remembered. You see this top component here, disregard the sun. And do you see the sun? Don't look outside, there's rain outside. Do you see the sun here? If you do, then you have already learned quite a lot about Chinese characters. This top part occurs in Chun as spring from the 4 seasons. It also occurs in 4 or 5 other characters, but there, if you go into what had been there before, you see different combinations of different graphemes, but for the sake of writing these characters more easily, all melted into the same shape in the modern Chinese signary. There were other processes that took place that you have already heard about, the phonetic and the significant component, that for certain characters, significant components were exchanged. And for a while, it was not quite sure which significant component would end up in the character in the future. So for the Han times, which is early Common Era, you have texts found in graves on silk and bamboo. And you have, sometimes you can collate them quite well because there is a textus receptus. And you see different versions at the same place, and the significance is different. So which one would end up at that time was not clear. Things happened also to phonetic components, which themselves could be complex. Sometimes they were shortened, abbreviated, graphemes were taken away, and there was only a remnant phonetic component, which might prove to be dysfunctional, seen if you look at the complete signary. Well, you have to examine, and I'm looking at the watch also, you have to examine a whole bunch of components and characters to see the details, and just to look at individual rows of characters through time doesn't really show them. I will try to show you what the script of the time in the Han Dynasty looked like. Oh, very good. These are calligraphic, but this one is the rubbing from a stone. I wish it would come right away, just bigger. Rubbing from a stone, here it is. You don't see many round shapes anymore, but the angles are not as pointed as they would later be at the end of the Han times, when the writing style was developed that we write today. Actually, although we write simplified characters, we write a style that was developed towards the end of the Han Dynasty. Thank you very much. You see in many characters a pronounced stroke, sometimes called a flourish. You see a pronounced stroke that gives the text a certain rhythm. You also see that by this time, the arrangement of characters on the stele, on the surface, has become quite orderly. This did not used to be the case before. We see here, by the way, a cow or an ox, a bœuf. We see an eye. Does it look like an eye? What happened now? I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you are there to help me. You see a horse here, and we see the horse has 4 dots at the bottom. The horse character used to be very pictographic, but in the end there are quite a few characters that have 4 dots at the bottom, and they are not always the legs of a horse. They're not even always the legs of some other animal. The source could be flames. They could be the claws of a bird. They could be the fins of fish, which all of these changes or the sameness of these four dots in a character contribute to a loss of information. If you do not know the rest, the 4 points will not tell you much. Now, I didn't do it. So this process changed the roles. It changed the shape of things. It changed the roles. I didn't do that either. Yes. So we have to go with our pictures. It changed the roles components could play in the character system. It changed the consistency between significs and phonetics and the meaning aspect of morphemes and the phonetic aspect of syllables. The iconicity was practically gone by the end of the Han Dynasty. And when electricity comes back, we could look at current characters, but maybe we won't be able to do that. Now I got lost by all this, about these little problems. Yes, I'm looking at my conclusion right now to conclude. By the time, Teresa had already mentioned the Shōben-jyezi, which was composed or was ready by the end of the 1st century of the Common Era. By the time the old writing styles had already become obsolete and their study had become an area of study for specialists, the writing that was mostly executed with brushes on bamboo slips or wood or silk maybe had become the usual writing style of the day. That is, by the end of the Han Dynasty, the transition to modern Chinese characters had already been made, and the shapes of characters and components that were received by the new students at the time were the status quo, and they often did not know what had been there before in the ancestry of each individual character. Which also can be seen actually from the Shōben-jyezi, because in some places its author was proven wrong in the meantime, as more texts were found in graves archaeologically. And actually, I showed you the oracle bones in the beginning. They were, by Xushen's time in the Han Dynasty, they were gone. They were buried beneath the ground and only resurfaced at the end of the 19th century in 1898 or 1899, which started a new branch of study. I'm very sorry that I could not support my presentation with pictures the way I had wanted to. In my abstract, I try to give you some hints what kind of keywords to use if you want to look it up with Google Images, so you can look at some examples. If you want to. I'm very sorry that this ended up so chaotic.
Thank you very much, Cornelia.
No.
Thank you for your efforts, and technical problems happen, so doesn't matter. We have time for 2 or 3 questions or comments. Are there any questions, remarks? Please.
I don't understand much about early Chinese writing, and I was wondering if you could clarify whether the the period in which these characters were written on bronze follows the beginning of that period follows the beginning of the period in which they began to be written on bone and tortoise shell and so forth by a significant margin? Or are we talking about roughly synchronous periods?
Yes, partly we are. I didn't make that clear. There are bronze vessels that have been found that are were cast at the same time that the oracle bones were still used.
But when did the bronze writing start?
Well, the earliest that we know go well back into 3,500 years ago. I don't know the exact earliest find that has been recorded. But actually bronzes were cast for a long time, and it's a durable material, and they can still be cast today, evidently. But the characters on the bronzes changed too as they changed elsewhere.
But the bone writing it's earlier than that, isn't it? Some of it, anyway.
Well, some there evidently have been some shells found that were slightly older than the earliest bronzes. Actually, of course, there have been bronzes also with no characters on them, just bronze objects, and there are many others with objects on them. The oracle bone practice continued into the Zhou period, so when the Zhou kingdom had been founded, and the bronzes also, but then the characters on the bronzes. Sometime in history, in the Zhou era, the bronze oracle practice was abandoned.
Okay.
That had to do with different thinking about the world.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I cannot be more specific, as archaeology is not my specialty. No. Yes, please.
There's a thing I don't understand. In the Chinese administration, this was administration, right? So they had a pond full of tortoises? Because we hear...
Oh, you're thinking about the practical...
how did they get so many tortoises?
Good question. How did they get all those tortoises? I imagine they had specialists who raised tortoises for these oracle purposes. I went to Anyang in the province of Henan, where the archives have been found. And it is really amazing how there are these meter-wide holes, several of them, not just one, with stacks and stacks of tortoise shells compressed by the pressure of the earth. And this practice of oracle bones went on for a long time, so I guess it was just a long tortoises of many, many years and centuries actually that are stored there. But maybe they had tortoise farms.
I think these things go over several hundred years, so you have time, to collect all this. And China is big, so and
yes, but
I don't know any details, but it's not that much of a.
The time was long, but the archives that have been found actually are quite concentrated around the area of the old capital of the Shang.
Yes, but the
Shang
capital has. I mean, if the king says bring some tortoises, then
that
probably happens.
Large,
yeah.
you can raise tortoises.